Something felt deeply wrong the moment she arrived. Nurses rushed, doctors assessed, but it was already too late. Only then did the calendar matter April 2022 at Spartanburg Regional Medical Center in South Carolina, where 14-year-old Heather Leanne Baird's desperate fight for survival ended before the world even realized it had begun. In the days that followed, investigators uncovered one of the most severe child neglect cases in Cherokee County's recent history. This was not the result of sudden violence, but of months of systematic abandonment perpetrated by those who were supposed to protect her. Medical records and testimony revealed a stark paradox. Heather had been born prematurely at just 28 weeks. Living with profound disabilities, including cerebral palsy, she could not speak, could not move independently, and required round-the-clock medical support. She was, by every measure, a child who needed more protection than anyone else. Yet instead of being safeguarded by the safety nets designed for children like her, Heather slowly disappeared from her community's sight and from the very systems meant to watch over her. That disappearance raises the unavoidable question, how could this happen? And this is where the silence becomes the story. Because for children who depend entirely on others, silence is never neutral, it is a warning. Each missed check-in, each unanswered concern, marked not just neglect, but a countdown. As we retrace Heather's story through court files and official records, we will not only examine what happened inside her home, but also confront the failures of oversight that allowed her isolation to deepen unchecked. Yes, the investigation revealed more than neglect. It exposed a deliberate pattern of concealment, shielded by pandemic fears, and a family who treated their disabled daughter not as a life to be cherished, but as a burden to be endured, or erased altogether. In the summer of 2007, the Baird family welcomed a fragile miracle, Heather Leanne Baird, born prematurely on June 6th after suffering a stroke in the womb. Doctors feared she might not survive, but Heather defied every medical prediction from the very moment she entered the world. Her family gave her a constellation of affectionate nicknames: Princess, Feather, Kudzu Girl, each one tied to the joy she brought. A joy that shone brightly despite her difficult start. One friend described Heather as an unexpected rainbow unicorn, magical, improbable, and awe-inspiring. Heather could neither speak nor walk, but medical records and her family's recollections reveal that she had a keen awareness of the world around her. She loved bright lights, bold colors, and music, especially the playful songs of artist Mikey Mason. On birthdays, her face lit up, eyes following the glow of candles and the sound of laughter. Though her cognitive ability was estimated to be similar to that of a 3-month-old infant, Heather could see, hear, and feel happiness through the presence of those around her. And that awareness makes what happened later all the more devastating. Heather could feel abandonment, but she had no way to call for help. In 2018, the Make-A-Wish Foundation granted Heather her dream trip to Disney World and Disneyland. In the photos, she sits in her wheelchair, eyes wide with wonder as she gazes at fireworks and beloved Disney characters, moments that seem to prove the love and care she deserved. Her Aunt Jessica later reflected Heather was a warrior. She inspired me to get through my darkest days. To her friends and family, Heather was a living symbol of resilience, a miracle who'd outlived every prognosis. But alongside her light was extraordinary fragility. Heather lived with spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy, yet chronic lung disease, heart and kidney problems, and frequent seizures. She depended entirely on medical technology, a tracheostomy to breathe, a feeding tube for nutrition, and machines that had to accompany her at all times. Doctors once suspected she might be blind and deaf, but later testing confirmed she could see and hear, making every glance, every laugh, and every embrace even more precious. And it is for this very reason that each moment she was left unattended later was not just neglect, it was a profound betrayal of her trust. Heather's story highlights an essential truth: when children cannot speak for themselves, the system must become their voice for those as fully dependent as Heather. Background checks and regular oversight of caregivers are not bureaucratic details, they are lifelines. The Disney smiles, the birthday laughter, are reminders of how vulnerable a child can be and how deeply it is our responsibility as adults to ensure that joy is never stolen away. The warning signs around Heather's well being didn't appear out of nowhere. They built up gradually, over years, long before her death. State records reveal that the Department of Social Services, DSS, had intervened more than once, first when Heather was still an infant, and again in 2016 when inspectors discovered a severe cockroach infestation in the home. At that point, Heather was removed immediately. But instead of creating a system of long-term oversight, the state returned her to the same environment, relying largely on promises of improvement. That was a critical chance to ensure her safety, and it slipped away. From 2016 through 2020, the signs became harder and harder to ignore. The family repeatedly skipped medical appointments. Heather's older brother, Edward, just 21 at the time, took on the role of her primary caregiver. Over an 18-month period, he was paid more than $25,000 by Access Home Care to provide respiratory care, despite completing only 10 hours of training. The unavoidable question lingers: could a young adult with so little medical preparation and under so much psychological strain truly shoulder the responsibility of caring for a child with such complex disabilities? The licensing system had placed life and death responsibility in his hands, but offered almost no meaningful supervision or support. The lesson is stark: when the care of a severely disabled child is entrusted to a single individual, especially a young family member, certification is only the beginning. Oversight, psychological support, and regular monitoring must follow. Without them, the burden of care can quickly turn deadly. And when oversight fades, the danger does not remain hidden for long. Then came 2020. The arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic marked a turning point, but in the most dangerous direction. The Baird family used the pandemic as a reason to cancel all medical appointments and cut off contact with extended relatives. Two aunts, Rebecca and Jessica, who had previously been granted emergency guardianship, were denied visits again and again. At first, because of COVID sounded like a reasonable explanation, but when the isolation stretched into a second year, the excuse wore thin. Still, no agency stepped in, no virtual check-ins, no phone calls, no requests for updated medical documentation to prove Heather was receiving care. The lesson is unmistakable for children who are completely dependent on caregivers. Silence and absence are never normal. They are alarm bells. When every line of contact goes dark, authorities must respond immediately, because each day without oversight is another day of risk. That is why the contrast feels so devastating. Meanwhile, the surrounding community had all but forgotten Heather. Neighbors later admitted they hadn't seen her in months. Some even forgot that a disabled child lived in the home at all. What they did notice were surface-level changes: a yard falling into disrepair, an unusual number of new pets. Yet no one connected those small signals to the hidden danger inside. The same child who had once smiled so brightly on her Make-A-Wish trip to Disney in 2018 was now living in total isolation. Systems that had once promised weekly, monthly, or quarterly check-ins had vanished with little more than an excuse. And that blind trust, left untested, created the very void where tragedy would take root. By early 2021, conditions inside the Baird home on Camp Ferry Road had deteriorated far beyond what anyone could consider livable. Court records show that neglect had shifted from missed medical appointments to outright, life-threatening danger. The family continued to receive regular state benefits, including Edward's caregiver salary, disability payments, and medical support funds intended to meet Heather's complex needs. But in practice, that money disappeared into household expenses, while Heather was left confined to her crib, deprived of the care she required, before continuing. It's important to emphasize what you are about to hear is not just messy caregiving. These are classic warning signs that a child has been placed in active danger signals no responsible lesson system or adult should ever ignore. The home housed as many as 40 cats and dogs, all in severe neglect, flea-infested, worm-ridden, malnourished. Trash was piled so high that only narrow paths remained through the rooms. The stench of ammonia from animal waste was so strong it peeled paint off the walls. Investigators later described rats the size of small dogs running across the floors. By itself, such an environment had it ever been seen by a medical provider, a neighbor, or any mandated reporter should have triggered an emergency intervention. The most haunting discovery inside Heather's crib. A dead dog was found, while 2 puppies had to be euthanized on site. Living conditions like these are never just about sanitation. They are direct warnings about child safety. This house was uninhabitable, and the bitter truth is that not a single official ever knocked on the door. Edward Bayard. Despite carrying the title of respiratory aide after a token training course, had nearly abandoned his caregiving role entirely. His parents, David and Bobby Joe, likewise stopped providing even the most basic needs for their daughter. And so Heather, a child unable to walk, unable to cry out, was left in her crib, helplessly watching her surroundings collapse. This reveals a painful paradox. A paycheck or a certificate never equals genuine care. Caregivers for severely disabled children need more than a piece of paper. They need a support network, oversight, and timely intervention to prevent caregiver exhaustion from turning into abandonment. The concept of caregiver fatigue has long been recognized in medical literature, but in Heather's case, no system ever stepped in to identify or address it once Edward could no longer manage the role. The neglect did not stop at small details. It escalated into a predictable, lethal pattern. Hospital records from this period show Heather was admitted multiple times for pneumonia and sepsis, serious complications that specialists universally describe as alarm bells for medically fragile children. And yet, instead of triggering heightened supervision, the system stayed silent. Promised weekly check-ins vanished. The mandated 6-month reviews never occurred. Even more troubling, these hospitalizations took place while Heather was supposedly under state protection. It forces the heartbreaking question, why did no medical professionals and no agencies recognize and report the clear neglect on display? What might have seemed like minor oversights, at first a few missed appointments, a convenient excuse about the pandemic, ultimately revealed the truth, a system that had grown stagnant and unresponsive. When responsibility is divided among too many agencies, but no one assumes ultimate accountability, a deadly void opens up, and it was into that void that Heather fell. The tragedy is that any single intervention, a home visit, a mandated medical check, a welfare report taken seriously could have saved her life. Before we go further, it's important to underline something. What you're about to read is not simply a lack of family communication. It is a textbook example of how a child can be pushed into danger when isolation is disguised as a reasonable precaution. As 2021 turned into 2022, Heather's isolation became absolute. Extended family, especially the aunts, who had once been active caregivers, were completely cut off. Whenever Rebecca and Jessica Melton tried to check on their niece, they were met with the same response: COVID-19 precautions made visits impossible. What they didn't know was that behind those explanations, Heather's condition had slipped into crisis. Later, both aunts recalled how their unease grew into desperate worry as months passed without a single sign of Heather's well being, no photos, no video calls, nothing at all. If you've ever felt uncertain about a child's safety, speak up. Your concern might be the only voice that child has. The aunt's testimony shows how their growing fear was stifled by reassurances about the pandemic. They did not know they had the right to request a welfare check through law enforcement or to file an anonymous report with Child Protective Services. That gap in knowledge is widespread and dangerous. Many believe they need hard proof before reporting. In reality, all that's required is a reasonable concern to trigger an investigation. The idea of warning signs hiding in plain sight became a tragedy here. Heather's physical condition showed unmistakable markers of neglect, pressure sores, untreated infections, severe tooth decay. Yet for over a year, no medical professional ever laid eyes on her. The family had built a wall of isolation, blocking every outside observer. Even payments from Access Home Care continued as if nothing were wrong, funds flowing automatically with no human verification of whether services were actually provided. That automation, without oversight, allowed the family to collect caregiver payments while Heather received no care at all. The surrounding community was shocked when the truth emerged. Neighbors later admitted they thought the family was simply being cautious because Heather was medically fragile during the pandemic. That assumption that isolation equaled safety helped conceal a devastating reality. Abuse and neglect can hide behind explanations that sound reasonable. Real protection for vulnerable children doesn't come from closed doors. It comes from transparency and regular verification. One neighbor recalled often seeing David Baird outside, but never asking about Heather, simply assuming she was being kept safe inside. The Baird case makes one lesson clear: communities must be educated on how to recognize and report risk. Anonymous hotlines exist precisely so people can raise concerns without fear of confrontation or retaliation. Every state has a number to call, and callers don't need proof. A reasonable suspicion is enough to launch an investigation that could save a child's life. The greatest barrier is not the lack of resources, it's the lack of public awareness about these reporting channels and the uncertainty about when to use them. And as those warnings went unheeded, the gaps in oversight widened. That is when small risks hardened into lethal danger, and when the final tragedy became inevitable. Before going further, it must be made clear what follows is not just a list of cold medical facts. These are the traces of prolonged neglect and a warning of how adult silence can kill a child. On April 11, 2022, David and Bobby Joe Baird carried Heather into Spartanburg Regional Medical Center. From the moment they entered the emergency room, staff noticed something chilling. David held his daughter as if she were a burdensome object, like a sack of potatoes. There was no urgency, no panic, none of the frantic instinct one would expect from a parent bringing in a child in crisis. His demeanor radiated detachment, a cold indifference that struck everyone present. The initial examination revealed Heather's condition. Beneath a knit cap, her hair was matted with dried blood. Her teeth had rotted to the point of constant pain. Her ears were completely blocked with wax. Her skin showed patches of bruising, crawling with insect bites, and even gnaw marks left by rodents. Medical staff recorded wounds resembling chemical burns, though, and in reality, they were the result of lying for prolonged periods in her own waste. The question here is not simply, how could this happen, but rather how many people passed by Heather's life without recognizing that a child was being left to deteriorate in plain sight. Subsequent findings only deepened the picture. Heather's lungs were filled with fluid from untreated pneumonia, leaving every breath a struggle. Her intestines were obstructed from severe constipation, causing relentless pain. Pressure sores had eaten through her skin, exposing tissue beneath. These were not signs of a sudden emergency. They were the markers of a slow, extended decline, a death. brought on by prolonged silence from both family and system. And it is here that the lesson must be emphasized. When a medically fragile child disappears from all outside view, no doctor visits, no teachers, no contact beyond the home, that must never be dismissed as a new normal. That is when action must replace assumption. During the intake, Bobby Joe tried to explain Heather's condition. She claimed that when she saw her daughter's oxygen drop to 30%, she placed Heather in cold water to stimulate her. To anyone with medical knowledge, this was absurd. Heather had a tracheostomy tube if her oxygen truly fell. The correct response was immediate professional intervention, not a folk remedy. To the nurses present, her words were not the reflection of desperate caregiving, but an excuse in the face of overwhelming evidence of neglect. And David, while doctors fought to resuscitate his daughter, witnesses saw him sitting in the waiting room, eyes fixed on his phone, visibly irritated by the disruption. That detachment left hospital staff stunned. Several admitted later they had never seen a parent so unmoved while their child was dying. The outrage here does not come from graphic detail. It comes from the stark contrast between the agony Heather endured and the apathy of those charged with protecting her. And perhaps the most haunting question remains: how many chances were missed before Heather was finally brought to that hospital? How many times through one phone call, one welfare check, one concerned glance from a neighbor, could this nightmare have been stopped before it became fatal? Before continuing, it must be stressed the following details are not presented to shock, but to understand the reality of the environment Heather was forced to live in. We can only prevent tragedies like this by facing the facts directly. The investigation after Heather's death moved quickly. Within 24 hours, law enforcement secured a warrant to search the Bayard home. Detectives had to don protective suits and gas masks before entering. The reason became clear instantly. Even seasoned officers were forced to retreat on their first attempt. Overwhelmed by the stench of ammonia and the suffocating conditions inside, they returned with specialized equipment, recognizing that what they faced was not just a crime scene, but a hazardous biological environment. What they found was far beyond the threshold of habitability. 40 dogs and cats roamed the home, all in various states of neglect. 2 puppies were so ill they had to be euthanized on the spot. 1 dead dog lay in the very crib where Heather had once been confined. Animal waste had accumulated to the point that ammonia fumes burned surfaces and caused chemical burns to the surviving pets. Flies, maggots, cockroaches, and rodents, described as the size of small dogs, infested the space. Garbage was piled everywhere, rotting food, soiled diapers, decomposing animals. No surface could be considered safe. The paradox is unbearable. Such conditions existed in a residential neighborhood, and no one ever knocked on the door. This is the reminder: environmental collapse inside a home is never just a sanitation issue. It is a direct signal that a child is in danger. Spartanburg County Coroner Dennis Fowler, an investigator with over 15 years' experience, called this the worst case of child neglect he had ever seen. His words carried weight, and the physical evidence supported them. The findings aligned with forensic reports documenting months, even years, of neglect. Fowler emphasized that no rational adult could live in such conditions without being fully aware. This made clear Heather's suffering was intentional, not incidental. As the investigation widened, the gaps in oversight became undeniable. Edward Bayard continued to receive caregiver pay through Access Home Care. Yet no one had ever verified that he was actually performing his duties. DSS, DDSN, and DHAs, the 3 primary state agencies, all cited the pandemic as the reason for halting supervision. But there was no evidence of substitute measures, no virtual check-ins, no calls, no requests for updated medical records. The system operated on a deadly paradox: payments were automatic. But oversight relied on human initiative, and when that human oversight failed, everything collapsed. Phone records and digital evidence revealed an even darker truth: Heather's isolation was not accidental, but deliberate. Beginning in 2020, a clear pattern emerged, canceling medical appointments, denying visits from relatives, blocking outside contact. The family had used the pandemic as a shield. Internal text messages showed discussions on how to keep others from seeing Heather. Chillingly, not one of those messages expressed concern for her health. When these details were made public, the community reacted with outrage. Neighbors admitted they had worried about the number of animals and the state of the home, but never thought about the vulnerable child inside. Here, another systemic flaw was exposed. Reports of animal neglect were never linked with child welfare. Animal control, code enforcement, and child protective services each held a piece of the puzzle. But no one put the pieces together. And that disconnect forces the larger question: how many more warnings will be missed if agencies continue to operate as isolated islands, rather than sharing information to see the full picture of risk? What investigators uncovered laid bare a tragedy beyond dispute, but evidence collection was only the beginning. Before we step into the courtroom, it's important to pause. What follows is not just about legal procedure, it is about how a society confronts truth. Can justice ever catch up after so many warnings were ignored? In May 2022, David, Bobby Joe, and Edward Baird were arrested on charges of homicide, child abuse, child neglect, and animal cruelty. Their case moved forward in Cherokee County, culminating in a 4-day trial from October 28th to October 31st, 2024, presided over by Judge R. Keith Kelly. The courtroom was packed. Extended family members who had been shut out from seeing Heather in her final years sat alongside community members and reporters, all waiting to hear whether justice could finally give voice to a child who had been forced into silence. Prosecutor Barry J. Barnett presented the case with unflinching clarity. No one, especially not a disabled child, should ever endure this. Heather was left to die, not in an instant, but over weeks and months. If this is not murder by child abuse, then what is? The evidence laid before the jury included autopsy results, photographs from the crime scene, and a detailed timeline showing prolonged neglect, even as the family continued to collect state care stipends. Forensic testimony was blunt. Heather died from a cascade of conditions that all trace back to neglect: oxygen deprivation, infection, pressure sores, and grossly inadequate hygiene, accumulating over at least a year. One detail that left the courtroom visibly shaken: Heather's body bore insect and rodent bite marks, proof of her complete helplessness in the environment she was left in. And so the central question extended far beyond this single case. If a child can suffer for so long, in plain sight of official paperwork that said she was cared for, how many other Heathers are still hidden in the shadows, unseen and unheard? The defense, despite effort, had little ground to stand on. They hinted at caregiver exhaustion and the disruptions of the pandemic. But those explanations collapsed against the fact that the family continued to accept funds while providing no care. If they were truly overwhelmed, why did they not reach out? Why did they not ask for help? Their silence and inaction became their answer. The defendant's demeanor only deepened the impression. Throughout the proceedings, the three sat largely unmoved, without remorse, without visible grief. Edward, who had been certified in respiratory care, offered no medical justification for his sister's state. For many observers, that cold detachment became a second layer of evidence. This was not helplessness, but choice. On October 31st, 2024, the jury delivered its verdict. All three were found guilty. David and Bobby Joe were sentenced to life in prison for homicide by child abuse, plus an additional 20 years for inflicting great bodily injury and 10 more for unlawful neglect. Edward received 30 years for homicide, with concurrent sentences for related charges. All three were also convicted of animal cruelty. In his sentencing, Judge Kelly did not soften his words. This crime represents the deepest betrayal of the trust that society places in parents and caregivers. The trial ended with heavy sentences, but no one in the community truly believed justice had been fulfilled. Heather was gone, and 3 family members were behind bars. But the larger question remained: how could a child waste away while so many different agencies had once placed their names beside the word protection? The Bayard case exposed a painful truth: policies existed, but implementation and coordination collapsed. The Department of Social Services, DSS, had once promised weekly checks for 3 years after Heather was removed from the home in 2016. Yet that commitment faded and then disappeared entirely when COVID-19 arrived. No virtual visits, no requests for updated medical records, a promise written on paper never translated into action. The question that should have been asked long before is stark when a child is completely dependent on care. Is there ever a justification for ending oversight? The answer is unequivocal no. The reality becomes even harder to accept when looking at how the financial system operated. Edward Bayard was paid more than $25,000 to care for his sister. Yet no one verified what he actually did. His respiratory technician credential required only 10 hours of training. In effect, the state handed the life and death care of a severely disabled child to a young man with almost no supervision. Can we honestly call that care? Or was it simply payment for silence? The system also created a bitter paradox. The family had a financial incentive to keep Heather alive in order to continue receiving subsidies, but no incentive to provide real care. What was intended as support became a cycle that helped lead to tragedy. By 2023, Heather's aunts Rebecca and Jessica Melton filed a civil lawsuit against DSS, DDISN, and DHHS for them. Justice for Heather was not only about the prison sentences of 3 family members, but also about holding agencies accountable for their inaction. They highlighted one haunting fact: Heather had been hospitalized for pneumonia, for sepsis during the very period when she was supposedly under state protection. And yet, not a single agency treated those hospitalizations as red flags demanding heightened oversight. The question for all of us: how many hospitalizations does it take before intervention is considered necessary? The broader picture reveals an even deeper flaw. When multiple agencies share responsibility, accountability becomes diluted. Each assumes someone else is watching. And in the end, no one truly is. To prevent repetition, experts have called for integrated data systems where every report, every hospitalization, every subsidy payment is connected and shared across agencies. The Bayard case reminds us that reform is not just about changing statutes, it is about how we treat silence. A child disappears from public life. A family suddenly closes its doors. Subsidy checks continue without verification. Each of these is a signal if we are willing to see it. Heather Leanne Bayard passed away at just 14 years old. But in that brief time, she left a mark that will never fade. Family and friends remembered her as a little princess, a resilient warrior, and a source of joy that lit up every gathering, even though she could not speak or move on her own. Heather responded to music, to light, and to familiar voices with smiles, with her eyes, with small gestures that showed she felt the love and care surrounding her. It was that very awareness that made Heather's death even more heartbreaking. She was not without perception. In fact, doctors confirmed she could feel pain and the absence of familiar comfort. A child who once glowed with joy at birthday parties was left to endure her final months in isolation and silence. Unable to call for help, the impact of her case extended far beyond the sentences handed down to her parents and older brother. It became a catalyst for wider discussions about how systems designed to protect the vulnerable can fail, and about the responsibility that communities must share. In the aftermath, organizations began holding workshops on recognizing and reporting signs of neglect, stressing that the silence or unexplained isolation of a child, or A disabled person should never be dismissed as the new normal. Meanwhile, those responsible for the tragedy are now living structured lives behind bars. David, Bobby Joe, and Edward Baird have all adapted to prison, reportedly considered model inmates. That contrast underscores a bitter irony. Heather, with no escape from the collapsing home around her, suffered until death, while the very people who abandoned her now find stability within prison walls. Heather's legacy, then, is not just in family memories or photographs from happier times. It is a reminder that oversight only matters if it is enforced, and that every member of a community has a role to play. Her story underlines a simple but sobering truth: when caregivers withdraw and the system withdraws with them, a child falls into a deadly void, and the responsibility to fill that void belongs to all of us. Heather Leanne Baird's life began with hope, a premature infant who defied medical predictions, a child who found joy in light and music despite profound disabilities. But her death wasn't only the result of individual cruelty, it was a collective failure. Every system built to protect her remained silent. Every person who might have stepped in turned away, and that silence killed Heather. The lesson left behind could not be clearer when we see a child unusually isolated, when medical appointments are missed, when a living environment falls into disrepair. This is never just a private family matter. That is the moment to ask questions, to act. Heather's death could have been prevented at multiple points. Each missed opportunity made the tragedy heavier. To honor Heather, we must turn grief into action, share her story so that one more adult understands they can report concerns, so that one more community realizes that silence means danger. Leave the name of your city and the time you're watching in the comments as a way to show that everywhere, people are uniting to form a vigilant network to protect the most vulnerable lives. Heather should still be smiling in a kindergarten classroom, not remembered as a victim of neglect. We cannot bring her back, but we can let her light guide us, a reminder that every child deserves protection, dignity, and love,